Vampire King pretends to be paralyzed to test his fiancée. But the cleaning lady shows true love. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night the king fell silent began with a storm that rolled across the northern mountains like a living shadow. Thunder echoed through the valley as rain struck the ancient stone towers of Blackthorn Castle. Inside the castle walls, hundreds of candles flickered against marble floors and dark velvet banners. Every vampire noble of the Northern Dominion had gathered that evening for a royal announcement. They stood in quiet circles beneath towering arches, whispering in low voices while musicians played a slow, haunting melody. At the far end of the grand hall stood the throne of Vampire King Adrian Blackthorn. The throne was carved from black obsidian and shaped like jagged wings rising toward the ceiling. For more than 6 centuries, Adrian Blackthorn had ruled the vampire world with a cold and unwavering hand. His enemies feared him. His allies respected him. His court obeyed him without question. Tonight, however, something felt different in the air. The king entered the hall dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the candlelight around him. His pale skin and sharp features gave him the quiet authority of someone who had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. As he stepped forward, every conversation in the room faded into silence. The nobles bowed their heads. Even the oldest vampires lowered their eyes in respect. Beside the throne stood Victoria Hale, the woman who was soon meant to become his queen. She was elegant and beautiful with golden hair and a smile that had charmed the entire court. Many believed she was the perfect match for the ancient king. But Adrian Blackthorn had lived far too long to trust appearances. Over the past few years, a quiet doubt had begun to grow inside his mind like frost spreading across glass. Too many smiles felt rehearsed. Too many promises sounded hollow. Too many loyal voices whispered different words behind closed doors. That was why tonight he had chosen to reveal the truth. Adrian lifted one hand slightly as if he were about to speak. The court leaned forward waiting for his words. Then suddenly his body froze. His hand trembled. The color drained from his face. A sharp gasp escaped several nobles as the king staggered backward. The next moment, the ruler of the northern vampires collapsed beside his throne. The sound of his body striking the stone floor echoed through the silent hall. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards rushed forward. Advisors shouted orders. Victoria Hale dropped to her knees beside him, calling his name with trembling urgency. But Adrian Blackthorn did not move. His eyes were open, but his body lay completely still, as if life itself had been locked inside a prison of unmoving flesh. A royal physician pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the fallen king. The entire court held its breath as the physician checked his pulse. When the old vampire finally stood, his voice carried through the hall like a cold winter wind. The king cannot move. Something has paralyzed him completely. Shock rippled across every face in the room. The most powerful vampire in the world had just fallen. None of them realized that behind those silent eyes, Adrian Blackthorn was fully awake, listening, watching, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The grand hall of Blackthorn Castle did not sleep that night. Servants hurried through endless corridors carrying candles, blankets, and sealed messages while vampire guards sealed the heavy iron gates that surrounded the castle grounds. The news had already spread across the stone halls like wildfire in dry grass. The king could not move. The king could not stand. The king who had ruled for more than 6 centuries now lay trapped inside a silent body. In the upper levels of the castle, physicians worked through the night in a chamber prepared for the fallen ruler. Velvet curtains had been drawn across the tall windows, and dozens of candles burned with steady golden flames. Vampire and nobles gathered outside the chamber doors, whispering to one another in tense voices. Some wore expressions of fear, while others watched with cold, calculating eyes. Power in the vampire world never remained empty for long. Far below those marble halls in the service corridors that most nobles never noticed another. Life continued quietly. Emma Carter pushed a wooden cleaning cart along a narrow hallway lit by small lanterns fixed to the wall. The wheels of the cart rolled softly across worn stone floors that had been polished by generations of servants. Emma was a human woman in her late 20s with brown hair tied back in a practical knot and tired eyes that carried the weight of long workdays. She had worked at Blackthorn Castle for nearly 2 years, cleaning hallways and guest rooms that belonged to creatures who barely acknowledged her existence. She wore a simple gray uniform and sturdy shoes that were built for walking many miles across the castle floors each night. Emma had never spoken to the king. In truth, she had never expected to see him up close. Servants like her lived in a different world, hidden behind staircases and narrow doors that led through the quiet veins of the castle. Her shift began each evening after sunset and often ended just before the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. Most nights were the same. She wiped dust from polished tables, gathered abandoned wine glasses, and mopped long hallways while the vampire nobility celebrated above her head. Tonight, however, the castle felt different. Emma noticed at the moment she stepped inside the main service entrance earlier that evening. Guards had doubled their patrols. Servants whispered to one another in frightened voices. Even the air felt tense, as if the walls themselves were listening. As Emma pushed her cart around a corner, she nearly collided with an older servant carrying a basket of linens. The woman stopped and stared at her with wide, worried eyes. "Have you heard what happened upstairs?" the woman whispered. Emma shook her head slowly. "I just arrived from my shift." "What happened?" The servant leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. "The king collapsed in the great hall tonight. They say he cannot move at all. Some say poison. Others say an ancient curse." Emma felt a chill spread across her arms. "The king collapsed," she repeated quietly. The servant nodded. "The entire court is in chaos. The physicians say he may never walk again." For a moment, Emma stood frozen beside her cart. She had never thought much about the mysterious ruler who lived somewhere high above the castle towers. To most human servants, he was more legend than man, a powerful figure whose presence shaped every rule within the castle walls. The thought of such a powerful being suddenly lying helpless in a bed felt strangely unsettling. The older servant hurried away, leaving Emma alone in the corridor once more. Emma resumed, pushing her cart, but her thoughts remained fixed on what she had just heard. As she climbed a narrow staircase toward the upper service hall, she noticed something unusual. Several guards stood posted outside one of the royal wings. Their dark coats and silent, watchful expressions made it clear that something important lay beyond those heavy doors. Emma lowered her eyes and tried to pass quietly, but one of the guards stepped forward and raised a hand. "You there?" he said in a calm voice. "The cleaning staff is needed in the royal chamber." Emma blinked in surprise. "The royal chamber?" she asked softly. The guard nodded once. "The physicians require the room to be maintained through the night. Fresh linens, clean floors, and silence." Emma glanced toward the closed doors that led deeper into the royal wing. Somewhere beyond them lay the most powerful vampire in the world, trapped inside a body that would not move. She swallowed slowly and tightened her grip on the handle of her cart. Then she nodded. "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. "I will take care of it." The guard stepped aside, allowing her to pass through the doors into the silent hallway that led toward the chamber of the fallen king. Emma Carter stepped quietly into the royal hallway, where the air felt colder than the rest of the castle. Thick carpets covered the floor, and tall silver lamps cast long shadows along the stone walls. This part of Blackthorn Castle was rarely seen by human servants. The rooms here belonged to the highest members of the vampire court. Powerful nobles walked these halls. Ancient advisors whispered behind these doors. And at the end of the corridor stood the chamber of the king himself. 2 silent guards remained outside the heavy oak doors that led into the room. Their pale faces showed no emotion as Emma approached with her cleaning cart. For a moment she wondered if she truly belonged here. Human servants rarely crossed into the royal wing, but one guard slowly opened the door and motioned for her to enter. Emma pushed the cart forward and stepped into the chamber. The room was larger than she expected. High ceilings arched above dark wooden beams, and tall windows were covered by thick velvet curtains that blocked the night sky outside. Candles flickered across silver holders arranged around a wide bed in the center of the room. The air smelled faintly of herbs and medicine. Several physicians stood nearby whispering to one another while carefully arranging small glass bottles and folded cloths on a long table. In the center of the room lay the ruler of the vampire world. Adrian Blackthorne rested on the bed, as still as a statue carved from pale marble. His dark hair spread across the pillow, and his sharp features were calm and unmoving. His chest rose slowly with each controlled breath, but the rest of his body remained completely still. Emma paused beside her cart as she looked at him for the first time. She had heard stories about the Vampire King from other servants during late-night shifts. They spoke about his centuries of rule and the wars he had ended with a single command. Some claimed he could hear a heartbeat from across an entire hall. Others said he had once stood alone against an army of hunters and walked away without a single wound. Yet now the most powerful creature in the castle lay silent and helpless beneath soft candlelight. One of the physicians noticed Emma standing near the door and gestured toward the floor beside the bed. "Clean the area quietly," he said in a calm voice. "The king must rest without disturbance." Emma nodded politely and moved her cart across the carpet. She began her work, carefully wiping dust from a nearby table and replacing several folded linens that had been left beside the bed. As she worked, she kept her movements slow and quiet. She had cleaned many rooms in the castle, but never one that held so much attention and tension at once. After several minutes, the physicians quietly left the chamber, leaving only the guards outside and the faint sound of burning candles. The large room felt strangely peaceful now. Emma finished folding a fresh blanket at the foot of the bed and glanced at the silent figure resting there. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring toward the ceiling as if trapped between sleep and waking. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke, softly without thinking. "That must be a difficult way to rest," she murmured gently while adjusting the blanket. "You cannot move, and everyone around you whispers as if you are already gone." Emma quickly looked around the room, realizing she had spoken out loud in the chamber of a king. But no one answered. The room remained silent, except for the quiet sound of her cleaning cloth brushing across the table. She exhaled slowly and returned to her work, unaware that Adrian Blackthorne heard every word. Inside the unmoving body of the vampire king, his mind remained sharp and fully awake. He had spent centuries studying the hearts of those around him. Tonight, he had allowed the entire court to believe he was helpless. Already, he had heard whispers of doubt from advisors outside the door. Already, he had listened as loyal voices faded into careful silence. Now another voice filled the quiet chamber. A soft human voice that carried no fear, no ambition, and no hidden agenda. Adrian listened as Emma moved quietly around the room. In the long centuries of his rule, very few people had spoken to him as if he were simply a man resting in a bed. For the first time since the test had begun, the Vampire King felt a small spark of curiosity awaken inside his ancient mind. Emma Carter continued her quiet work inside the royal chamber while the night deepened outside the thick stone walls of Blackthorne Castle. The candles burned lower, and the storm beyond the velvet curtains faded into a distant whisper of rain. For a long time the room remained peaceful. Emma wiped the polished wooden table beside the bed and carefully arranged the glass bottles that the physicians had left behind. She replaced a folded cloth with a fresh one from her cart and gently shook out a blanket before placing it neatly at the foot of the bed. The entire time she worked, she tried not to stare at the silent figure resting on the mattress. But it was difficult to ignore the presence of someone whose name had shaped the entire castle. Adrian Blackthorne had ruled the vampire world for centuries. His decisions had ended wars and created alliances between clans that once hunted each other through dark forests and ancient cities. Emma had heard many stories about him from the kitchen staff during late Night breaks. Some claimed he was colder than winter ice and spoke only when necessary. Others said he possessed a mind sharper than any sword and could sense a lie before the liar finished speaking. Yet the man lying before her looked nothing like the powerful legend she had imagined. His face was calm and pale beneath the candlelight. His hands rested motionless on the blanket as if they had been carved from stone. Emma finished cleaning the bedside table and quietly pushed her cart closer to the window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to check the latch and saw the last of the storm clouds drifting across the moonlit sky above the mountains. When she turned back toward the bed, she noticed something that made her pause. The king was still staring upward toward the ceiling with the same distant gaze he had held since she entered the room. His eyes were open, yet strangely empty, as if the world around him had drifted far away. Emma hesitated before speaking again. She knew servants were expected to remain silent in royal chambers, but the stillness of the room made the rule feel strangely heavy. "I suppose it must be lonely," she said quietly while adjusting the curtain. "Everyone in the castle fears you so much that they probably forget you can hear them." Her voice was soft and calm, not mocking and not afraid. Emma returned to the side of the bed and gently smoothed a wrinkle in the blanket near his shoulder. "You probably cannot answer," she continued in the same gentle tone, "but if you can hear me, I hope you know that the physicians are doing their best. The castle may feel strange tonight, but people still care about what happens to their king." She stopped speaking and looked around the quiet room again. No one entered the chamber. No voices echoed from the hallway. The only sound was the faint crackle of candle flames. Emma sighed softly and pushed her cart toward the door. As she reached for the handle, a sudden rush of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The door opened quickly, and several members of the vampire court stepped inside the chamber. Their dark coats brushed the floor as they moved toward the bed with urgent expressions. Among them stood Victoria Hale, the woman who was meant to become the queen of the Northern Dominion. Her golden hair fell across her shoulders, and her eyes glistened with what appeared to be sorrow. She approached the bedside slowly and looked down at Adrian Blackthorne. "My king," she whispered with trembling emotion. "The court physicians say you cannot move and cannot speak." She reached for his motionless hand and held it gently, as if she feared it might disappear. Emma stepped quietly aside, allowing the nobles to gather around the bed. From where she stood near the wall, she watched the scene unfold in silence. Victoria lowered her head beside the king and spoke again in a voice filled with sorrow. "If you can hear me, please know that I will remain by your side. I will protect your throne and your kingdom until you recover." Several nobles behind her nodded solemnly, as if her words carried great loyalty and promise. Yet inside the still mind of Adrian Blackthorne, the ancient ruler listened carefully to every tone and every pause. He had begun this silent test to reveal the truth hidden within the hearts of those closest to him. The first night had already begun to show him more than he expected, and as the chamber filled with whispered promises, the vampire king waited patiently for the deeper truths that would soon follow. The royal chamber slowly grew quieter as the members of the vampire court began to leave one by one. Their whispers faded into the hallway until only the faint echo of footsteps remained beyond the closed doors. Victoria Hale lingered beside the bed longer than the others. She held Adrian Blackthorne's hand gently, while candlelight flickered across her calm but carefully controlled expression. Anyone watching from the doorway would have believed they were witnessing a woman grieving for the fallen ruler she loved. Emma Carter remained near the wall beside her cleaning cart, trying to stay unnoticed while the nobles finished their visit. After a few silent moments, Victoria slowly released the king's hand and stood upright. She looked down at him with a soft, sorrowful gaze, as if she wished he could hear her final words. "Rest, my king," she said quietly. "The kingdom will remain safe. I promise I will protect everything you built." With that, she turned and walked toward the door where two advisors waited for her. Emma lowered her eyes respectfully as the nobles passed, and the chamber door closed once again. The silence returned. Emma listened for a moment to make sure no one else was coming before she resumed her work. She replaced several empty bottles on the table with fresh water and straightened the folded linens that had shifted during the visit. As she worked, she noticed the faintest sound coming from the hallway beyond the door. It was not loud enough for most human ears to notice, but Emma had spent long nights in the castle learning to recognize quiet movements beyond walls and corridors. She paused and glanced toward the door without moving closer. On the other side, voices had begun to speak again. The first voice belonged to one of the older vampire advisors who had stood beside Victoria earlier. His tone was low but tense. If the king does not recover, soon the council must consider the future of the throne, he murmured. We cannot leave the Dominion leaderless for long. Another voice answered quickly, and this one belonged to Victoria Hale. Her voice sounded very different now that she believed no one else was listening. Calm replaced the sorrow that had filled her words beside the bed. The kingdom will not remain without guidance, she replied quietly. The council already knows who stands closest to the throne. Emma felt a strange chill run through her chest as she listened from across the room. The voices continued speaking outside the door, unaware that their quiet conversation drifted through the narrow gap beneath the frame. The advisors sounded cautious, but curious. Some clans may challenge the claim of a queen who rises while the king still lives, one of them said. Victoria answered without hesitation. If the king remains trapped inside that silent body, he will not rule again. The court will accept stability over uncertainty. And stability is something I can provide. Inside the chamber, Emma stood frozen beside her cart. The words felt heavy in the quiet air. She slowly glanced toward the bed, where Adrian Blackthorne lay exactly as he had before. His eyes remained open and distant, as if he had heard nothing at all. But inside the unmoving body of the vampire king, every word had reached him clearly. The voices outside confirmed the first signs of truth that his silent test had been designed to uncover. Loyalty was already beginning to shift. Promises were already changing shape. The footsteps outside moved away down the hallway, and the voices faded until only silence remained again. Emma looked back toward the door for a long moment before turning toward the bed. I suppose people speak more honestly when they think no one can hear them, she said quietly as she picked up a cloth and wiped the polished table once more. She did not expect an answer. Yet across the room, the ancient mind of Adrian Blackthorne listened to the simple observation with growing interest. The first cracks in the loyalty of his court had begun to appear, and the silent test had only just begun. Morning arrived slowly over Blackthorne Castle as pale gray light crept through the narrow spaces between the heavy curtains of the royal chamber. The candles had burned low during the long night, leaving only thin streams of smoke drifting through the still air. Emma Carter returned quietly with her cleaning cart, just as the castle bells marked the early hour before sunrise. Servants moved carefully through the corridors, whispering to one another as they passed. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. News of the king condition had spread through every level of the fortress before the night had ended. By the time Emma reached the royal wing, she could feel the tension in the air like an approaching storm. Two different groups of vampire guards now stood outside the chamber door. Their eyes followed every movement in the hallway, and their hands rested close to the hilts of their swords. One guard opened the door when he recognized Emma and allowed her to enter without speaking. Inside the chamber, Adrian Blackthorne remained exactly where he had been the night before. His body lay still upon the bed while the faint morning light revealed the sharp lines of his pale face. His eyes remained open and silent, staring upward, as if the passing hours meant nothing to him. Emma pushed her cart softly across the carpet and began replacing the candles that had nearly burned down to wax pools during the night. As she worked, she noticed that the hallway outside the chamber had grown busier. Several vampire nobles arrived in quiet groups, speaking in careful tones that barely carried through the thick door. The moment they entered the room, their expressions shifted into polite concern. One elder lord stepped forward beside the bed and looked down at the king with a heavy sigh. Such a tragedy, he said slowly. The Dominion stands on uncertain ground without its ruler. Another noble nodded beside him. The clans will begin asking questions very soon. Stability must be maintained for the sake of the kingdom. Emma kept her eyes lowered while she replaced the last candle on the silver stand near the window, but she listened carefully to every word. The nobles spoke as if the king could not hear them at all. Yet inside the silent body of Adrian Blackthorne, the ancient ruler observed every change in tone, every careful phrase, and every glance exchanged between the members of his court. For more than 6 centuries, he had governed creatures who thrived on power and influence. He understood the language of ambition better than most kings understood their own armies. Now, as he listened from behind unmoving eyes, he could already sense the shifting current of loyalty moving quietly through the room. After several minutes, the nobles left, and the chamber grew quiet once again. Emma finished cleaning the table beside the bed and carefully arranged a fresh blanket across the king's shoulders. She paused for a moment, studying his face in the growing morning light. "I suppose everyone is worried about who will sit on the throne if you cannot stand again," she said softly while smoothing the edge of the blanket. "It must be strange hearing people talk about your future while you cannot answer them." Her voice carried no fear and no hidden motive. It sounded like someone speaking gently to a patient who needed comfort. Emma stepped back and pushed her cart toward the door, but before leaving she glanced once more at the silent figure on the bed. "I hope they remember that a kingdom is more than a crown," she added quietly. Then she slipped out of the chamber and closed the door behind her, leaving the room peaceful once again. Inside, the still body of the vampire king Adrian Blackthorne continued listening to the quiet echoes of the castle beyond the walls. The whispers of ambition, the careful promises of loyalty, and the simple honest words of a human servant had begun to reveal the true shape of the court around him. And the silent test he had begun was only growing more revealing with each passing hour. By the time the second night settled over Blackthorne Castle, the atmosphere inside the fortress had begun to change in ways that only careful eyes could notice. The servants still walked quietly through the corridors, and the guards still stood watch at every doorway, but beneath that order something colder had begun to move through the castle halls. Rumors spread faster than candlelight. Some said the king would never rise again. Others whispered that the vampire clans beyond the mountains were already asking who would claim the throne if the ancient ruler remained trapped inside his silent body. Inside the royal chamber, Adrian Blackthorne continued to lie motionless upon the wide bed, while the shadows of evening stretched across the walls. To every person who entered the room, he appeared exactly as he had since the night of his collapse. His body did not move. His voice did not speak. His gaze remained fixed and distant. Yet within that stillness his mind remained sharp and watchful as ever. Emma Carter arrived once again, pushing her cleaning cart quietly through the royal doors as the last light of dusk faded from the windows. She noticed immediately that the chamber felt more crowded than it had the night before. Several vampire nobles stood near the foot of the bed, speaking in hushed voices, while 2 advisors studied scrolls spread across a nearby table. Victoria Hale stood beside the bed dressed in dark velvet that reflected the soft candlelight around her. When Emma entered the room, Victoria briefly glanced toward her, but quickly returned her attention to the silent king. The nobles did not lower their voices this time. Perhaps the long hours had convinced them that the king truly could not hear anything happening around him. One advisor leaned close to another and spoke with careful seriousness. "The council must meet before the end of the week," he said quietly. "The Dominion cannot remain uncertain while rival clans watch from beyond our borders." Another noble nodded slowly. "If the king does not recover, the throne must pass to someone capable of ruling." Victoria remained silent while the others spoke, but her posture remained calm and confident. After a moment, she stepped closer to the bed and rested her hand lightly upon the blanket near Adrian's shoulder. "My king," she said softly with an expression of deep concern, "the kingdom waits for your strength, but until that day arrives, the court must remain united." Her voice carried a tone of devotion that would have convinced any listener of her loyalty. Yet Adrian heard something beneath the surface of her words that few others would notice. It was the steady confidence of someone who had already begun imagining a different future. Emma quietly began her work near the window, wiping the silver candle holders and replacing several empty water glasses on the nearby table. As she moved across the room, she could feel the tension growing thicker with each whispered conversation. The nobles spoke about council meetings, clan alliances, and the stability of the throne, as if the ruler of the dominion had already faded into memory. One young noble finally spoke the thought that several others had clearly been considering. If the king remains like this for much longer, he said carefully, then perhaps the court should begin preparing for a new ruler. The room grew briefly silent. Victoria slowly turned toward the noble who had spoken and studied him with calm eyes. "The kingdom does not abandon its king lightly," she replied in a steady voice. "Its stability must always come first. The clans will follow whoever can protect the dominion." Her words hung quietly in the air like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Emma finished polishing the candle holder beside the bed and glanced briefly toward Adrian's unmoving face. She wondered if it was possible for someone trapped inside silence to hear the shifting loyalties around them. Then she returned to her work, unaware that every word spoken in that room had reached the ancient mind of the vampire king. And as Adrian listened from behind still eyes, the first true twist of his silent test became clear. The woman who stood closest to the throne had already begun preparing to stand upon alone. The following evening, a cold wind moved through the high towers of Blackthorn Castle and carried with it a restless energy that every creature inside the fortress could feel. Word had already traveled beyond the stone walls that the vampire king remained trapped in silence. Messengers had ridden through the night to distant territories, and ancient clans had begun sending their own envoys toward the castle. In the corridors of the royal wings, servants walked faster than usual, and guards doubled their watch along the long halls. Emma Carter pushed her cleaning cart slowly through the same corridor she had crossed the previous nights. She could hear low conversations drifting from nearly every doorway. The entire castle seemed to be waiting for something to happen. When she reached the door of the royal chamber, the guard stepped aside once more and allowed her to enter. Inside the room, the candles were already burning, and several members of the court stood gathered near the window, speaking in tense whispers. As Emma rolled her cart quietly across the carpet, she noticed that their voices carried a sharper tone than before. The uncertainty surrounding the throne had begun to turn into open concern. One tall noble with silver hair spoke with clear frustration. "The clans in the eastern valleys are already asking who commands the armies now," he said. "If the king cannot lead them, they will begin choosing their own alliances." Another advisor shook his head slowly. That kind of division could tear the dominion apart within months. Emma kept her eyes lowered as she replaced a candle near the bedside table, but she listened carefully to the growing tension. At the center of the room, Victoria Hale stood with her hands folded calmly before her. Her voice carried a quiet confidence that seemed to steady the nobles around her. "The dominion will not fall into chaos," she said. "The court will ensure that leadership remains strong until the king condition changes." One of the advisors studied her thoughtfully. "And if the condition does not change?" he asked. Victoria did not answer immediately. She looked down at Adrian Blackthorn, unmoving figure, and gently touched the blanket near his shoulder as if offering comfort. Then she lifted her gaze back toward the council. "The kingdom must always survive," she said. "The clans will follow the one who protects their future." Her words drifted through the room like a carefully placed promise. Emma moved toward the far table and began wiping its polished surface, but she could feel the atmosphere tightening around every sentence spoken near the bed. The nobles were no longer speaking about hope. They were speaking about control. After several minutes, the discussion ended, and the nobles slowly left the chamber one by one. When the door finally closed behind them, the room returned to its familiar quiet. Emma exhaled softly and pushed her cart closer to the bed. She adjusted the blanket around the king's shoulders and glanced at his still face. "You probably hear all of that," she said gently. "People begin thinking about power very quickly when they believe someone cannot stand anymore. She straightened a pillow beneath his head with careful hands. It must be difficult to listen to people planning the future while you cannot answer them. Emma paused for a moment, studying his silent expression before continuing her work. Outside the window, the wind brushed against the stone towers, and the distant sound of castle bells echoed through the night. Inside the chamber, the ancient mind of Adrian Blackthorne absorbed every word spoken by nobles and servants alike. Each conversation confirmed what his silent test had begun to reveal. The court that once swore loyalty to his throne had already begun preparing for the moment when that throne might stand empty. And among all those shifting voices, only one voice in the room carried no ambition at all. The quiet voice of the cleaning lady who spoke to a king as if he were simply another human being resting after a long day. The night grew deeper around Blackthorne Castle, and the ancient fortress seemed to settle into a tense and uneasy rhythm. Torches burned along the outer walls, and distant guards walked their slow patrols across the stone bridges that connected the towers. Inside the royal chamber, the air remained still except for the faint movement of candle flames and the quiet sound of Emma Carter cleaning cloth brushing across polished wood. It had been several days since the night the vampire king collapsed in the great hall, and the castle had already begun to adjust to a world where its ruler could not move or speak. Yet every hour that passed only sharpened the tension inside the court. Emma worked quietly beside the tall window that overlooked the northern mountains. The storm clouds from earlier in the week had cleared, and moonlight now spread across the dark forest beyond the castle walls. She replaced a fresh glass of water on the table beside the bed and carefully adjusted the blanket across Adrian Blackthorne's shoulders. The king remained exactly as he had been every night before. His body lay still beneath the candlelight, while his pale eyes gazed upward in silent stillness. But inside that unmoving form, the ancient mind of the vampire king remained fully awake. Adrian listened to every small movement within the chamber and every distant whisper that drifted through the halls beyond the door. In his long centuries of rule, he had learned that the truth about loyalty did not appear during moments of strength. It appeared when power seemed to vanish. That was why he had allowed the entire court to believe he had fallen. Already the results of his silent test had begun to reveal themselves. Advisors had spoken carefully about the stability of the throne. Nobles had begun discussing council meetings and alliances with distant clans. Even Victoria Hale, the woman who was meant to become his queen, had started speaking about the future of the kingdom as if the king no longer stood within it. Yet among all those shifting voices, one presence remained unchanged. Emma Carter moved quietly through the room with the steady patience of someone who expected nothing from the powerful figures around her. She did not speak about politics. She did not whisper about the throne. She simply cleaned the chamber each night and treated the silent king as if he were a person resting after a difficult illness. When she finished wiping the table, she paused beside the bed and studied his face for a moment. The candlelight reflected softly in his still eyes. "You know," she said gently while straightening the edge of the blanket, "people out there keep talking about the throne as if it is the most important thing in the world. But I do not think a kingdom is only about power." She rested her cleaning cloth on the table and folded her hands calmly. "My father used to say that a real leader is the person who protects everyone even when no one is watching." Emma gave a small, thoughtful smile as she continued speaking. "I suppose that sounds very simple compared to the way nobles talk about crowns and alliances." She reached for the glass of water and set it closer to the bed, as if preparing it for someone who might wake at any moment. "But if you can hear me, I hope you remember that there are still people in this castle who believe you will stand again." She stepped back from the bed and pushed her cart toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused and glanced once more toward the silent figure resting under the candlelight. "Try to rest," she added softly. "Even kings deserve a little peace sometimes." The door closed quietly behind her, leaving the chamber silent once again. For several moments, nothing moved except the faint shimmer of candle flames. Then deep within the still body of Adrian Blackthorne, a new realization settled into the ancient mind of the vampire king. For days he had listened to ambition, fear, and calculation echo through the halls of his castle. But the quiet honesty of a single human servant had revealed something the nobles had forgotten. True loyalty did not come from power or titles. Sometimes it appeared in the simplest kindness offered to someone who seemed to have lost everything. The following night, the castle corridors carried a heavier silence than before. News had reached every corner of the Dominion that the king still had not moved, and the uncertainty had begun to turn into quiet ambition. Messengers arrived from distant vampire clans while council members held private discussions deep inside the stone halls of Blackthorn Castle. Behind closed doors, the question was no longer whether the king would recover, but what would happen if he did not. Inside the royal chamber, the candles burned steadily, while Adrian Blackthorn remained motionless upon the bed. His eyes still faced the ceiling, and his body showed no sign of life beyond the slow rise and fall of his breathing. To everyone who entered the room, the ancient ruler appeared completely trapped inside silence. Yet behind that stillness his mind continued to listen to every sound in the castle. That evening Emma Carter had finished her work earlier than usual, and the chamber remained empty for a long while. The quiet allowed Adrian to hear distant footsteps echoing through the corridor beyond the door. Eventually the handle turned slowly and the door opened once more. Victoria Hale stepped inside the chamber alone. She closed the door carefully behind her and stood still for a moment, as if making certain that no one else had followed her. The room was silent except for the soft flicker of candlelight. Victoria approached the bed slowly until she stood beside the motionless king. Her expression no longer carried the sorrow she had shown in front of the court. Instead, her eyes held a calm and thoughtful focus as she studied Adrian's silent face. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly into the stillness of the chamber. "It is strange how quickly the court begins to change," she said softly. "Only a few nights ago, every noble in this castle bowed the moment you enter the room. Now they whisper in hallways and pretend loyalty while they wait for the throne to become empty." She folded her hands behind her back and slowly walked toward the window before turning to face the bed again. "I stood beside you for many years," she continued. "I listened to every council meeting and watched every decision you made. The clans believed I was simply your future queen, but I learned far more than they realized." Her voice remained calm and controlled. "If you could still move, perhaps things would have continued the same way for centuries more. But the world does not pause for anyone, not even a king who ruled for hundreds of years." She walked back toward the bed and stopped beside him once again. "The council will gather in 2 days," she said quietly. "They will claim they are protecting the kingdom, but they are really protecting their own power. I intend to give them what they want: stability, leadership, a ruler who can stand when the old one cannot." She leaned closer, as if studying the silent gaze that stared past her. "I almost wish you could answer me," she murmured. "It would make this moment far more interesting. But since you cannot speak, I suppose the throne will simply pass to someone who can." She straightened and took a slow step away from the bed. Outside the window, the wind moved across the distant mountains, while the candlelight flickered across the stone walls. Victoria looked around the chamber one last time before turning toward the door. "When the council meets," she continued softly, "the Dominion will finally have a queen who understands how power truly works." She opened the door and disappeared into the corridor, leaving the room silent once again. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then deep within the still mind of Adrian Blackthorn, the final truth of his silent test settled into place. The woman who claimed to stand beside him had already begun claiming the throne he still ruled. And now that he knew exactly who she truly was, the ancient king understood that the moment of revelation was drawing closer than anyone in the castle could imagine. Morning arrived with a pale silver light spreading slowly across the towers of Blackthorn Castle. The wind that had whispered through the mountains during the night now carried the distant sounds of hooves and carriage wheels approaching the fortress gates. Messengers from several vampire clans had arrived before sunrise, and the castle courtyard filled with dark cloaks and cautious glances. Inside the royal wing, the tension that had quietly grown over the past days had finally reached a breaking point. Members of the council gathered in the great council chamber where a long stone table stretched beneath tall windows that looked out over the valley. Advisors whispered among themselves while guards lined the walls in complete silence. Everyone in the Dominion now knew that the king had not moved since the night he collapsed. And now the council intended to decide what would happen next. Inside the royal chamber, Adrian Blackthorne still lay motionless on the bed beneath the dim glow of candlelight. His body remained exactly as it had for days, while the ancient ruler listened to the changing rhythm of the castle around him. Outside the chamber, footsteps passed more frequently, and voices carried sharper urgency. The council meeting had begun. For the first time since the night of his fall, the castle had gathered to discuss the future of the throne. A short while later, the door opened, and Emma Carter quietly entered with her cleaning cart. She paused just inside the doorway when she noticed how still the room felt. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath while the council decided the fate of their ruler. Emma moved softly across the carpet and began replacing several candles that had burned down during the night. After a moment, she glanced toward the silent figure on the bed. "Today must be important," she said gently while adjusting the blanket near his shoulder. "I heard the council gathering downstairs." She straightened the pillow beneath his head and looked toward the window where pale daylight slipped between the curtains. "Everyone is talking about the throne," she continued quietly. "Some people sound worried, but others seem almost eager." Emma gave a small, thoughtful sigh as she pushed her cart closer to the table beside the bed. "I suppose power makes people impatient," she said. "When they believe a leader has fallen, they begin imagining themselves in the empty place." She replaced the glass of water and folded a clean cloth beside it, as if preparing for someone who might wake at any moment. "But I do not believe a kingdom is truly lost just because its king has grown quiet for a while." Emma rested her hands lightly on the edge of the cart and looked toward the silent king once more. "My father used to tell me that strong people sometimes step back and watch before they decide what to do next." She smiled faintly at the memory. Perhaps he was wrong, but I always believed there was wisdom in waiting. The chamber fell quiet again after her words. Outside, the castle bells echoed across the stone towers, announcing the beginning of the council session. Emma finished adjusting the last candle holder and slowly pushed her cart toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused and glanced back toward Adrian's unmoving figure. "Whatever happens today, I hope the people making those decisions remember that the throne belongs to the one who protects the kingdom, not the one who reaches for power the fastest." With that, she slipped quietly out of the room, leaving the chamber empty once again. Moments later, distant voices began echoing faintly through the castle halls as the council arguments grew louder. Advisors debated the future of the Dominion, while nobles spoke about stability, leadership, and the need for a ruler who could stand before the clans. And as those voices rose and clashed within the council chamber, the silent king continued to listen from behind unmoving eyes, knowing that the moment when truth would finally reveal itself was drawing closer with every passing minute. The council chamber of Blackthorne Castle echoed with rising voices as the debate over the throne stretched deeper into the afternoon. Tall windows cast long beams of gray daylight across the stone floor, while ancient vampire nobles argued in controlled but intense tones. Some demanded patience and loyalty to the king who had ruled them for centuries. Others insisted the Dominion could not wait for a ruler who might never rise again. At the center of the chamber, Victoria Hale stood calmly beside the long stone table with her hands folded before her. She did not raise her voice like the others. Instead, she waited with quiet confidence while the council argued around her. In another part of the castle, the royal chamber remained silent and dim. Adrian Blackthorne still lay unmoving upon the wide bed as the candle flames flickered gently beside him. The castle bells had already rung several times, marking the passing hours of the council meeting. Adrian listened to every distant sound through the stone halls. He could hear the echo of voices drifting faintly from far below where the council gathered. The moment he had waited for during his silent test was finally unfolding. After some time, the door of the chamber opened once again, and Emma Carter stepped inside with her cleaning cart. The castle corridors had grown quieter now, as nearly every noble had gathered in the council chamber. Emma paused beside the doorway for a moment, listening to the distant rumble of voices before she resumed her work. She moved slowly around the room, replacing candles and wiping the polished table beside the bed. The chamber felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension that filled the rest of the castle. Emma glanced toward the silent king and gave a small, thoughtful sigh. "I suppose the council is deciding the future of the throne right now," she said gently, while straightening the blanket across his shoulders. "Everyone down there probably believes the kingdom stands at the edge of great change." She placed a fresh glass of water beside the bed and folded a clean cloth carefully on the table. "But sometimes the future is not decided in loud rooms filled with arguments," she continued quietly. "Sometimes it is decided in quiet moments when people show who they really are." Emma stepped closer to the bed and looked down at the pale face of the king. For several seconds, she remained silent before speaking again. "If you can hear me, I hope you know that not everyone in this castle has forgotten who you are," she said softly. She rested her hand gently against the edge of the blanket, not touching him directly, but offering a quiet gesture of comfort. "Even if the entire court decides something different today, I believe a real king does not lose his throne simply because others grow impatient." Emma removed her hand and stepped back toward her cart. "My father always said that true strength is revealed when people believe you are powerless." She gave a faint smile at the memory before turning toward the door. Outside the chamber, the wind brushed against the stone towers, and distant voices from the council chamber rose once more in heated discussion. Emma pushed her cart slowly toward the exit, but paused once more beside the bed. "I hope things become clear soon," she said quietly. "The castle feels like it is holding its breath." With that, she slipped out of the room and gently closed the door behind her, leaving the chamber silent once again. Inside the unmoving body of Adrian Blackthorne, the ancient ruler reflected on the words he had heard from nobles' advisors and a single human servant. The council believed they were deciding the fate of the throne at that very moment. Yet the truth had already revealed itself through the actions of those around him. And now that the final pieces of his silent test had fallen into place, the vampire king knew the time for silence was almost over. The council chamber had grown louder as the final arguments echoed against the tall stone walls of Blackthorn Castle. Ancient nobles stood around the long table, speaking over one another while advisors tried to restore order. Some demanded patience and loyalty to the king who had ruled them for centuries. Others insisted the Dominion needed a leader who could stand before the clans immediately. At the center of the chamber, Victoria Hale finally raised her hand, and the room slowly fell silent. She stepped forward with calm confidence and faced the gathered council. "The Dominion cannot remain uncertain any longer," she said in a clear, steady voice. "Our king has not moved for days, and the clans are already questioning our stability. If we wish to protect the kingdom, we must accept the truth before us." Several nobles nodded slowly while others exchanged uneasy glances. One elder lord leaned forward across the table. "And what truth is that, Lady Hale?" he asked. Victoria lifted her chin slightly and spoke with quiet authority. "The throne requires a ruler who can lead. If the king cannot rise, then the Dominion must choose someone who can protect it." A murmur moved through the chamber as her meaning became clear. At that very moment, the heavy doors of the council hall opened. The sound echoed sharply across the room, and every head turned toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped through the doorway. For several long seconds, the chamber fell completely silent. Adrian Blackthorne walked slowly into the room. The vampire king moved with calm strength across the stone floor, as if the past days of silence had never existed. His pale eyes swept across the stunned faces of the council members who stared at him in disbelief. One advisor nearly dropped the scroll he was holding. Another noble stepped backward, as if he had seen a ghost. Victoria Hale remained frozen beside the table, her confident expression slowly fading as the reality of the moment settled in. Adrian continued walking until he stood at the head of the council table, where his throne normally overlooked the chamber. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the quiet authority that had ruled the Dominion for centuries. "It appears the council has been very busy discussing the future of my throne," he said calmly. No one answered. The silence in the room felt heavier than stone. Adrian allowed the moment to stretch before continuing. "I wish to understand the true loyalty of those who claim to serve this kingdom. So I listened while the court believed I could not hear them." His gaze moved slowly across the council members until it finally rested on Victoria Hale. The woman who once expected to become queen lowered her eyes, unable to meet the king's steady stare. "You spoke with great confidence about the future of the throne," he said quietly. "Yet you forgot one important truth. A crown does not belong to the person who reaches for it the fastest. It belongs to the one who protects the kingdom even when no one is watching." Victoria said nothing. The council remained silent as the weight of the king's words settled over them. After a moment, Adrian turned away from the table and looked toward the doorway, where a small group of servants had gathered in shock at the sight of the king walking once more. Among them stood Emma Carter, still holding the handle of her cleaning cart. Adrian's gaze softened slightly when he saw her. "During these past days," he continued, "there was only one voice in this castle that spoke without ambition. Only one person treated the fallen king as a human being instead of an empty throne." The council followed his gaze toward the quiet cleaning lady standing near the door. Emma looked confused and quickly lowered her eyes. Adrian gave a small nod of recognition before turning back to the nobles. "Let this be remembered," he said calmly. "Power reveals many truths, but kindness reveals far more." The council bowed their heads as the ancient ruler reclaimed his place at the head of the chamber. And throughout Blackthorn Castle, the whisper of the king return spread through every corridor, carrying with it a lesson that the court would never forget.